Hello. Hello. This is Claudia Miller. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with everyone and that you tuned in the middle of your day. Denise, thank you for your help with the seminars. It's an excellent seminar series. I'm going to be talking today about environmental exposures and new way of looking at how they may be linked to autism. As you know, autism is not just one condition, but a whole range of conditions, and there are increasing numbers of environmental exposures that are being linked to autism. So how does all this work, and how can we help your child or help your family understand what things might be related to their condition? So I'm going to go through these slides. Also, I should say there's an e-book that's been made available to you. And that e-book is actually 32 pages long, and it contains much of the same material. And if you wish, certainly free to send that on to others. That's really the purpose of it. And of course, this webinar is going to be available through YouTube. So I'm really pleased this can have some outreach to other people. So the question is about an exposure mechanism called TILT, Toxicant-Induced Loss of Tolerance. Some of you may have heard about this before, but there's growing information pointing toward the fact that certain people who are more susceptible, and of course there's a whole range of different susceptibilities based on prior exposure and based upon genetic susceptibility. After an initial exposure, and that's at the actually at the bottom of your iceberg on the right-hand side, some people develop intolerances, so they lose tolerance for things that never were a problem for them before, including everyday chemicals, foods, drugs, and in adults we see alcoholic beverages, caffeine, and other food additives, and so on. Once a person develops this TILT phenomenon, they are now sensitive, and these low-level everyday exposures and foods can trigger symptoms. The real obstacle here is understanding which symptoms are being triggered by which exposures. And there's a phenomenon called masking. And you see that with the water line on the right, it says masking. It's difficult to see and understand everything that's triggering someone's symptoms without going through some effort and some very careful detective work. But if you look at the tip of the iceberg, you see the word symptoms. What happens is doctors come along, and we doctors come along, and we make a diagnosis based upon a person's symptoms, whether it's depression, irritability, ADHD, autism, all of these different symptoms. And different doctors, of course, diagnose different conditions and often multiple problems in different patients. The more doctors people see, often more diagnoses they collect. So what is explained by TILT? Well, there are several related conditions, and I've called these the 7 A's, if you will, because for ease of memory. Autism, of course, is one. ADHD, autoimmune diseases, addiction, asthma, allergies, especially non-IgE, so non-immunological kinds of adverse responses, and then affective or mood disorders. And I think you can see that these are comorbid conditions frequently in the families that we're talking about here. They are conditions that we feel are often related to an environmental exposure. And the two steps are initiation by some exposure event, which I'll talk more about, and then subsequent trigger of symptoms by everyday exposures that we all have. So that's the principle of TILT, and these are some of the interrelated conditions that we've been concerned about with TILT. As you know, things are now, fortunately, looking at both genes and environments, that they interact together. It's no longer just about genes. There are no genetic epidemics. Genetics, as people say, loads the gun, so it starts the process, or maybe underlying the process, but the environment is what pulls the trigger, and that's really increasingly common thinking in the autism world since we discovered that the illnesses that we've dealt with by cloning the human genome really aren't explained completely, or even in part, oftentimes by understanding and enumerating the particular genes that a person might have. So now we're going more toward what role does environment have? Can it be the only thing in some cases, or is it more often gene-environment interactions, that genes interact and the environment interacts with our genes, and then it manifests as various symptoms. Chemical intolerance, autism, and ADHD are similar in that they are growing concerns in every developed country. I just returned from Japan, where I was looking at some of the indoor air concerns in that country. They have a tremendous concern also about autism, as do most developed and even developing countries. And the question is, why are we seeing the enormous increase that we have seen over recent decades? And I know you've all seen those prevalence graphs, so I won't go into that. But they kind of look like this in some ways. Synthetic organic chemical production has increased over the last 40 years or so. So since 1940s, after World War II, we had an exponential increase in the production and the use of synthetic organic chemicals, and these have found their way into our lives, whether it's in our homes, offices, or schools. So they're chemicals emitted into the environment, and they're present in our diet and water frequently too. So these chemicals are with us now, as they never have been. Prior generations, my grandparents didn't have these present. It was before World War II, and now virtually all of us are exposed to these things. Similarly, pesticide production, and pesticides, as you may have read, are suspected as being a contributing factor to autism by much of the recent research. Pesticide production since World War II, since the 1940s, has increased exponentially. And then we actually don't know all the data in recent years because there's so many other kinds of pesticides that have been introduced well beyond the original ones. So now we're dealing with not just organophosphates, but pyrethroids and a variety of other pesticides that have been implicated by some in causing autism, or at least contributing to it. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about indoor air and why it's important in our understanding of all of the 7 A's and autism. 90% of us spend 90% of our day indoors, and that is in our offices, homes, schools, vehicles. In fact, people who are dealing with an illness may be spending more time at home. Mothers who are pregnant may spend more time at home. And certainly small children may spend more time at home. So indoor air exposures are tremendously important in terms of our overall body burden, if you will. There are increased indoor air pollution sources. We have plasticizers and pesticides, as I mentioned, many volatile organic chemicals, solvents, and so on that are present in our indoor air. And I'll show you a picture of what an air sample looks like in indoor air in a few minutes. There's also, at the same time, been a decrease in the fresh air that we get in our homes and offices because of the energy conservation efforts that have been made in recent decades. Plus, we're dealing with evolutionarily novel substances, things that were not present prior to, again, World War II. So many of these things like plastics and flame retardants and so on were not present in our grandparents' or great-grandparents' environment. And these evolutionarily novel substances, these new substances, are things that we may not have ability to detoxify and remove. And increasingly, this is being demonstrated. So I mentioned indoor air and what indoor air might look like if you took an air sample in a building where people were having health problems. And this is an example of one of those office buildings. The upper graph shows a series of peaks, each of which represents a single volatile, what we call volatile organic compound, something that is getting in the air, like a solvent, something that you have to breathe because it's present in your indoor air. And you can see how many different chemicals are present in this one air sample. And the height of those peaks are proportional to the concentration of the substances that are present. I compare that to the lower graph of outdoor air. And outdoor air, and this is just outside the same building, has many fewer chemicals present. And the concentrations are much lower, as represented by the much smaller peaks. So we know from a wide variety of research on indoor air, something that really isn't talked about in the medical literature But in the environmental health literature, and specifically the indoor air literature, people who are involved with studying indoor air know this to be true, but most doctors, most people don't understand how important these low-level exposures are, and they think they're low-level and therefore inconsequential. This is not true. These may be parts per million or parts per trillion, but think about how much does it take of a chemical to disrupt normal neurogenesis, normal neuron growth, affect the brain. It's very tiny amounts of neurotransmitters and so on actually affect the brain in dramatic ways, and we need to understand these exposures, which are a big part of our lives now. So indoor air is critical. If you look at ventilation in our buildings in this next picture, you see that there was a much higher rate of ventilation required for offices. Now, this is in offices back in the past, so around the turn of the century, but the amount of fresh air coming into buildings now is greatly reduced. There are air standards, air ventilation standards, which reduced around the time of the oil embargo in the late 70s, reduced how much fresh air was brought into buildings in order to conserve air in those buildings. And some of you may live in or work in buildings where the air has not been very good. And this is the reason. People and owners of buildings have been trying to conserve energy, and actually it reduces their costs for operating a building if they reduce how much fresh air is brought in, because by reducing the fresh air that's brought in, there's less heating and cooling of the air required, and a greatly reduced cost of operating a building. So the incentive to people who are operating any kind of building, be it a government building, a school, is to reduce fresh air coming in, because it increases their costs if they don't recirculate the air. And of course, when they recirculate the air, then you have much more opportunity for these chemicals to accumulate inside the air you're breathing. So this is sort of a hidden thing that's been going on for years. I was a consultant to the EPA on their own sick building, and this had a lot to do with it, the reduction in fresh air for the building, as well as the new chemicals that were being used, installing new carpet, for example, in the EPA headquarters. And those were the sources, new furnishings, new carpeting, and glues that were used to glue down the carpet, and not sufficient fresh air coming into various parts of the building. So this we know from past history is a problem, and then you might say, well, what about homes? Well, for homes, there is no fresh air requirement. And what happens is we seal up our homes, and we reduce the amount of outside air coming in, whether you're doing that because of allergies, whether you're doing it because of having better insulation on your building or your home in order to reduce, make it more energy efficient. Those are things that reduce the fresh air, and of course anything that is being released into the air, whether it's from new furnishings, fragrances that are being used, if there were mold present, all of those things, you have less fresh air available to dilute whatever is present. And this is a really important concept to understand. So if you have questions about it, please do ask when we finish. So let me talk a little bit more about chemical intolerance, because it's part of what has happened. One of the results of tightening up our buildings and having many more chemicals in our air. About 5 to 15% of people report multiple chemical intolerances, but many more people are having trouble with exposures than just that 5 to 15%. There was a survey done, national survey, where they're asking people whether they consider themselves especially sensitive to everyday chemicals, like those in household cleaning supplies, paints, perfumes, soaps, garden sprays, or things like that. And about 50% of the population said yes. But many people are having trouble with exposures, whether it's tobacco smoke, fragrances, or something else, and they may not consider themselves especially sensitive, but it still may affect their health. If we understand what masking is, that the more exposures we have going on in our environment, the harder it is for any of us to attribute our symptoms to any particular exposure. Frequently, the intolerances that people develop after being in a sick building or after pesticide exposure or something like that include foods, medications, alcoholic beverages, and again, in adults, caffeine. And this is what we've seen in our studies of people who've gotten sick, like in the EPA building, or after having after sick building, or having their home sprayed with pesticides. Those sorts of exposures lead to these intolerances. And what is an intolerance? Well, this is normally you expect to tolerate your foods and the things that you have in your environment. But this is a change in people's tolerance, and it's been observed in industrial populations as well as in homeowners. From some recent studies we've done, we're comparing mothers' reports of their own children's intolerances. And with ADHD or autism, there were more requirements for because of ear infections to have tubes. Multiple infections requiring prolonged use of antibiotics if their children, if these mothers were themselves chemically intolerant. So in other words, the mothers of children who have autism or ADHD have more reports of being intolerant to substances than do control mothers. So we think there is more, it could be genetics and or environment, but we think both are contributing to their susceptibility to exposures. Interestingly, reactions to vaccines that prompted a call to the doctor, there really wasn't an increase in the ADHD group mothers, but in the autism mothers, there was a reported, and again, this is self-report, threefold increase in having adverse reactions to vaccinations. Now, it's also adverse reactions to other medications, antibiotics, various chemical exposures. So we think it's a generalized intolerance, and the question of vaccinations is certainly currently a very increasingly hot topic that I don't hope to get into in this. But certainly the mothers of children with autism do report more of this in their children. And they're more likely to call a doctor. The other thing, they're more likely to call a doctor because the child's having ear infections. And once you do that, you're going to be having more antibiotics and other kinds of medications. Compared to control mothers, mothers of children with ADHD or autism did report more sensitivity to odors themselves, such as smoke, nail polish remover, exhaust from engines, gasoline, air fresheners, or cleaning supplies. And it was significantly increased in both groups, but especially in mothers of children with autism. Again, suggesting that they have more susceptibility to chemical exposures, either because of prior exposure and or their own susceptibility. Food allergies or intolerances were increased among mothers of children with autism, not significantly so with ADHD, but my experience is that children with ADHD have many food intolerances. Strong food preferences or cravings, this was strongly significant in both groups, almost like addictions to whether it was sugar or wheat or sodas with caffeine or something else. Those addictions are really important, and those are a hallmark of toxicant-induced loss of tolerance. People lose tolerance for a food, and then they have reactions to them that involve withdrawal and irritability and all kinds of other behavioral problems. And at that point, you have someone who is addicted to a substance, because one way to get away from that addiction, get away from those adverse symptoms, the withdrawal symptoms, depression, irritability, is to take more of the substance. So that's the addictive part of this. It's a tendency toward addiction. And if I had put money on what I think is going on in terms of neurological phenomena, I think addiction gives us a really good insight into what brain areas may be involved and why we see some of the symptoms that we do. These individuals are not addicted. In fact, they avoid addictive substances in many cases, but the reactions in the brain suggest a phenomenon like addiction. Allergies certainly increased in both groups, and significantly so. So how are chemical intolerances, just focus on autism, how are chemical intolerances and autism alike? So multi-system symptoms, especially neurocognitive symptoms, mood changes, gastrointestinal symptoms occur both in adults who have chemical intolerance and in children with autism. The adults we've studied, and we've studied, hundreds of patients who report chemical intolerance following some kind of exposure, like pesticides or sick building. It can be initiated by pesticides and other foreign substance, foreign chemicals like indoor air contaminants in both cases. Food intolerances, of course, occur in both, and it's a source of many symptoms once people develop these intolerances. Again, that's the loss of tolerance they've experienced as a result of initial exposures. Food cravings are extremely common in both, chemical intolerances in both, and then drug allergies and adverse reactions. I put a star by that because you see that in adults with chemical intolerance and in children with autism. So these are giving us hints about what we know from our studies of adults that is relevant to autism. So how can we determine the role of exposures in autism in any particular case? What's really needed for research and for diagnosis and treatment are environmental medical units, or so-called EMUs, environmental medical units. And these simply eliminate background chemical exposures in a hospital-like setting, so in a medical setting, so you can closely observe the individual and then test them, their responses to various substances. Using an EMU, we can determine, does an individual improve with avoidance of everyday exposures? And this includes chemicals, foods, drugs, having clean water available. And are symptoms triggered when common foods and everyday chemicals are reintroduced one at a time? This is a scientific way for understanding and sorting out what is really a problem for particular individuals. And it's highly individualized medicine. This is personalized medicine. I call this takeaway medicine. Instead of adding drugs and adding different kinds of treatments, for a little while, maybe a couple, 3 weeks in an environmental unit, you remove as much as you can, see how the person or the child responds, to what degree do they improve. If they improve significantly, which is what's been observed, and I'll show you a case in a minute, then you can reintroduce single foods and everyday chemicals one at a time. Most of the work that's been done in the past on autism and ADHD has involved some limitation in diet, but the kinds of foods that bother people are so highly individual that you cannot do this without really getting people to a clean baseline first and then introducing things one at a time. It isn't just wheat and it isn't just milk, but it can be very specific foods a person may have in their diet and not even realize that it's a problem. Often the foods that the children or adults crave or eat frequently, in other words, several times a week, are foods that need to be eliminated for a time, up to maybe a week or 10 days, and then reintroduced. But this has not been done for most of the research in this field. So how does an EMU work, an environmental medical unit? You have an individual who's reacting to many common everyday exposures, and they have stimulatory and withdrawal symptoms. So they may feel a little better, they may feel hyper, they may feel very talkative, running around, feeling, it depends if it's a child or an adult, but very, very active, very stimulated. And then subsequently on the withdrawal side, and look at those sine waves, those curves. Initially there's stimulatory responses and then withdrawal responses, and those are the sine waves, those are the curves that go downward. Those are times when the person may be lethargic or depressed, cannot concentrate. And so the symptoms vary over time after a particular exposure. Here we've shown the overlapping effects of exposures, chemicals, foods, drugs, and so on, in a particular individual. This is one individual before they've been worked up in an environmental medical unit. And you can see at any point in time, you can't tell which symptoms they're having or what they're coming from, what's causing them. There's so many variables. If a person then is placed in an environmental medical unit, and this should be a really nice hospital setting, then you see those sine waves playing out. In other words, they get to a background level, they get to a clean baseline after a week or up to a week inside this kind of place. And actually 4 days may be enough in some cases. Then you have a period of time when the person's at their best, the child's at his or her best, and you can reintroduce single exposures one at a time. And the advantage is that now you can see their responses to particular things, particular foods, or common indoor air exposures. low-level exposures. And you see those responses in the absence of all the background noise that you had at the very beginning of this. So in the beginning, they're in their homes and they're exposed to everything there at home, at school. Put them in the clean unit for a week or 10 days, and you can see how much their symptoms improve after that point in time. If they improve significantly, then it will take probably up to a few weeks, 2-3 weeks, to start identifying the foods that are triggering their symptoms and to help their family clean up the environment so that they're not having these adverse responses. The last section of this graph is really just repeating what was identified in the first. In other words, you want to repeat an exposure. You don't want to assume somebody has an intolerance for a particular exposure unless you reproduce it, either in the environmental unit or at home, and do show that this is indeed a problem for them. One of the problems that we run into is people start eliminating everything in their diet and get down to almost nothing to eat. And we want to avoid this by being more specific in identifying foods that are a problem. This is a picture of an environmental unit and what it might look like. It could look like an ordinary hospital unit. It could be, even friendlier than this. But the idea is that you've taken some steps, and these are the steps. You've designed a unit with filtered air supply and continuous air monitoring to ensure the removal of volatile organic chemicals. Usually it's a charcoal filtration that's used for this. Fine particles are removed. HEPA particles, HEPA filtration can be used to get rid of those fine particles. So you have virtually clean air, as clean as we can get. And then it's operated under positive pressure. In other words, relative to the surrounding hospital environment, it's under positive pressure so that any leakage of contaminants goes out of the unit rather than coming into it. Patients are offered pure spring water or filtered water, not organic foods, and it's constructed out of non-outgassing furnishings and materials that don't release chemicals into the air. So no particle board, for example. Using the safest possible cleaning and operational practice, so you would not put pesticides in this unit. And cleaning would be done without using toxic cleaning supplies. Mostly these units, if they run well, there's very little in them that's causing problems in the air because you have all that filtration of the air before it even gets into the unit. Now, I mentioned I was in Japan, and Japan has gone to great lengths to try to design homes that are safer for chemically intolerant individuals, that protect children, and protect the unborn. And they talk about this. They see the importance for their future generations. They're in some ways more visionary than we are in this country. There's one builder there who has built over 1 million homes, and they have turned to adopting the practice of having the minimal outgassing inside the homes using ideal materials, adequate ventilation, and other things. And they are doing very well selling these homes to families who can't afford them. Now, not everybody can afford these yet, but if you look back to the days of the germ theory, not everybody could afford a home with sanitation, running water, for example, or sewers. But that's what we realized we needed. And so over time, homes are built to be more safe and more helpful for their occupants. And Japan is already taking huge steps in that direction. I think they're a model for the world in this regard. And as I mentioned earlier, they have increasing rates of autism in that country, and this is of tremendous concern to them. They are a country and a people who think about their future generations. They're much more focused on that than we are as a country. Let me give you one case of an individual, a child, who's worked up in an environmental unit, actually here in the United States. And this was by a physician named Theron Randolph. He had the first environmental medical unit. He did a lot of early descriptions about this. And unfortunately, he's not with us anymore, but he had the principles and documented the principles of how an environmental unit should work. And early on, before there was this attention to autism, he did have a child who was referred to him, a 10-year-old, whose name, this is the name he used, Paula Rossi, and he was extremely hyperactive. He couldn't complete even the admission interview because of kicking, shoving, pushing on others around him, racing around the exam room, overturning furniture, and tearing papers. And this, they knew he was hyperactive, but only as time went on they realized he would fit the diagnosis of autism too. Temper tantrums began around 13 months old for this child. He was learning well until he was 17 months old, when he began to forget words he had already learned. Does that sound familiar? And this was written back, decades ago. He was distant, could not relate to others around him. He was transferred from one school to the other in an effort to, probably because he was just hard to deal with, placed in school for problem children and tranquilized, occasionally placed in a straitjacket. And realize this is well before current understanding of autism. Doctors had suggested drugs, vitamins, institutionalization. The Feingold diet, which was a family adopted at first, removed some, but not all, of the synthetic additives in the foods, and not all of the foods that were a problem. Because he didn't improve on the Feingold diet, his mother sought a more personalized approach, and that's where she sought out there in Randolph. His history of addiction, so these addictive-like responses to foods and other exposures, led to flares of behavioral problems. So he was up and down, sort of a Jekyll and Hyde kind of picture. He was susceptible to everyday environmental chemicals, so cleaning agents the mother might use, and everything else that you all are familiar with. Screaming, kicking, biting, much like a seizure, after exposures to perfume, nail polish, or similar cosmetics, so there are a whole host of things, structurally unrelated chemicals that were triggering his symptoms. Once they got him to a clean baseline, then they could see the effects of each of these things. After 5 days in the environmental medical unit, his behavior improved greatly. When they reintroduced corn, it resulted in a temper tantrum. And so for Randolph studies among adults, actually corn, wheat, milk, and eggs were the most common triggers for adults' symptoms. But it can be any food. And indeed, in this child, he had adverse reactions to apricots, raisins, grape juice, yeast, beet sugar, honey, lamb, and hot dogs. And this was in addition to corn. Organic foods, interestingly, did not trigger symptoms in this child. For example, when they tested him with honeydew melon, broccoli, and peas. But when these were given as conventional store-bought foods, which contained pesticides or food coloring or something of that sort, they did cause his hyperactivity to flare. He was very irritable and had an increase in his autistic behaviors. So Paul, as they learned, needed truly organic food as well as the right foods and avoiding chemical exposures to stay well. Otherwise, his parents found it almost impossible to deal with him. And Randall comments in his writings, with appropriate diet, despite the supposedly incurable nature of his problems, specifically with autism, he's able to lead a normal life. But you can see what Herculean efforts it takes to reverse these intolerances and get the child set on a proper course. Of course, children are not just little adults. We all know that. But in certain ways, children are like adults in terms of the detoxification pathways that we all share. These determine our susceptibility to things. 90% of us spend 90% of our day indoors. And we're all exposed to evolutionarily new chemicals, foreign chemicals and substances by all routes: inhalation, ingestion, skin contact, things that did not cause problems in prior generations because they weren't in our environment. Exposures in mature but chemically susceptible adults leads to toxicant-induced loss of tolerance, TILT. And in children, whether they're in utero or somewhat older, these same exposures affect their developing nervous systems, immune system, endocrine systems. And instead of causing reversible kinds of effects, over time, these may be more permanent. The specific effects may depend upon, of course, the nature of the chemicals, timing of exposure, the dose the child or adult received, and the susceptibility of the individual. In working with patients, adults who are chemically intolerant, and I've been doing this for the past 25 years, we've developed a validated published questionnaire, which is a screening tool for chemical intolerance. And we're using that tool, using that questionnaire, in mothers of children with autism and ADHD, like I mentioned earlier. That's where that data came from. There are 50 questions that are self-administered. It takes 12 or 15 minutes to take it, and it helps people understand their symptoms and intolerances. The challenge is if they're very masked and they have a lot of symptoms, they may need to be in an environmental medical unit for a while. Differences, again, are due to differences in detoxification ability and the history of prior exposure. So if there was a pesticide exposure or remodeling in a home, those are often precursors of developing chemical intolerance, and for autism too. This is a questionnaire that we've used in our studies, but now it's being used internationally for diagnosing and knowing what to do, treating patients who are chemically intolerant. It's not specifically geared to children, although we're working on a pediatric version, but it's for adults who, for example, pregnant women who may be expecting a child, and they want to know if they are more vulnerable to chemical exposures and therefore need to take specific steps, better steps to protect their unborn child. And frankly, when parents are concerned about their children or their next child, that's when they're most willing to take these steps to identify exposures that may be contributing and reducing what may be reducing use of chemicals that could lead to tilt. This is from the questionnaire I just mentioned, and this is just showing simply how a person's symptoms were before they were exposed in, let's say, a sick building, in this case, and then after the exposure. And you can see, if you look at the online book that you'll have access to, you can actually take this questionnaire, this queasy questionnaire yourself, and draw out any changes you may have had before and after an exposure that you suspect may be related to an illness. And this can be done for children too. So tilt involves loss of tolerance, and again, initiating toxic exposure or exposures may lead to it. It may be a series of exposures. There's a fundamental breakdown in innate tolerance, and then you see adverse and amplified responses to previously tolerated and structurally diverse exposures, including common chemicals, foods, drugs, alcoholic beverages, and caffeine. So this is what we see in adults, and I was very surprised when I was on sabbatical at NIEHS and talking to parents of children with autism. This is back when they held the first conference. The director at that time was holding the first conference with parents about autism and watching some of the first birthday movies. When I spoke to parents, they told me that many of them had problems with chemical intolerances and food intolerances, and of course their children had these kinds of problems too. What's the evidence for toxicant-induced loss of tolerance, or TILT? Similar reports of illnesses developing in different regions and countries following an identifiable exposure event. Again, sick buildings are common, pesticides, but also exposure to solvents, exposures in the workplace. And subsequently, new intolerances, complaints of new intolerances for foods, alcoholic beverages, caffeine, and medications, not just chemicals. So the fact that adults were complaining of sensitivities, intolerances for foods after an exposure in a workplace, we found this, and this is what is described as a compelling anomaly. It's an observation that's not explained by usual paradigms for illness. This phenomenon resembles addiction. In many ways, I have a paper in the journal Addiction about its parallels, and that's a reference in that online booklet that you will receive. There's a plausible anatomic locus. Obviously, the brain is intimately involved in this, but certain systems, parts of the brain are clearly implicated, and the booklet goes into that. And there's some recent animal models that point to this loss of tolerance if you have an animal model, but nothing's as good as observing it in people, because animals can't tell you when they're depressed. You can't tell if they're having difficulty communicating easily, where children and adults can tell you so much more about the effects of low-level exposures. And we need to pay attention to that. Again, this is in the booklet you'll be getting. I don't want to lose time for questions, but you can see the array of different exposures that appear to be able to cause tilt. Indoor air, volatile organic chemicals from these sources like new carpets and mold and fragrances, solvents, glues, paints, gasoline, nail polish remover. These are all different kinds of substances that have been implicated in tilt. Drugs and medical devices, combustion products, pesticides, cleaning agents. There are case after case of people developing chemical intolerance following these kinds of exposures. And what kinds of symptoms do people report? There's a little bit more on this in the booklet you'll be receiving, but it involves any and every system of the body. Many are so-called neuropsychological symptoms. When I say that, I mean things like ADHD, depression, bipolar disorder, panic disorder, migraines and other headaches, seizures, autism. These are very common among people who develop tilt. And then, of course, other parts of the body are affected too. So recurrent infections, cardiovascular responses, respiratory problems like asthma. These are all conditions that can be comorbid, occur with autism and ADHD, or in the same families. So what are the next steps? Well, what we think is important is to adopt what I call a personal precautionary principle. In other words, we know what the precautionary principle is, but you need to do it on a personal basis because, you know, the government's not going to regulate this stuff for you, and they're not going to take commercials off the airwaves that, you know, advocate for a lot of chemicals that we know are not safe for us. And we can make choices about the things we buy and what we use in our homes. And I'll get into that in a bit more. We can construct environmental medical units for research, diagnosis, and for treatment of patients. So this is a personal precautionary principle in pregnancy. I have to thank Tatiana Walker for helping draw this up. It's a very simple, simplified, but clear example of things that women who are pregnant should be advised by their doctors, or if they're even thinking about getting pregnant, since exposures during the first month of pregnancy can be a risk factor. And again, that's in the little booklet in terms of what parts of the brain are developing, and the development it starts as early as the first month of pregnancy. The neural tube forms. And so we need to be thinking about these exposures even before women know they're pregnant. So hopefully their mothers and their families and their doctors will help them think about this if they're intending to get pregnant. So here's some of the ideas. Instead of spraying pesticides, you can use baits, traps, and food containers that you don't have release of chemicals in the air that you breathe. Using paints that are safer, cleaners that are safer, avoiding scented products. All of us can tell with our noses what those are. Particle board, furnishings, new carpet that is outgassing. These are large surface areas that release tremendous amounts of volatile organic chemicals into a home, especially a home that does not have adequate ventilation. So I'm going to finish with this slide. If you wish to access our website or newsletter, the e-book, you'll get a link to the e-book thanks to the folks at ARI. I think they're putting this whole presentation on the internet through YouTube. I'm sorry. Obviously, I don't watch YouTube that much, but it's an incredibly valuable resource, and it's available to everyone. Even if you didn't hear this presentation, you can access the YouTube presentation and also the e-book through that. And the e-book has a lot more information than I was able to compress into this presentation. So I'm ready for any questions if there are some out there.
Yes, Dr. Miller, your questions are in the chat area. So if you open the chat, you can start from the bottom or you can scroll to the top. And if you could read the questions aloud and then
Sure.
and then answer them, that'd be great.
Great. So first question is about using green cleaning products, thinking may reduce the chemical exposures in your home, and is that my understanding as well? I think we need to be careful because what is being labeled as green may not be safe in terms of people's exposures. There's a big difference between green cleaning and products that are advertised to promote their purchase and what may be safe in terms of tilt. Tilt is a very different kind of thing. So I wouldn't say green is necessarily clean, let's say safe. Here's another question. How would I get EMU testing done through an immunologist's participation in a study? I'd be interested, just not sure how to get the service. Is it commonly covered by insurance, or is it funded out of pocket? Sadly, although this has been a leading proposal, having a diagnostic environmental medical unit, when we worked with the Gulf War veterans and other groups, Autism, there still has not been one built. People are approximating some features of it, but currently we don't have one that meets the criteria, all the criteria for a clean environmental medical unit, and one that could be used for research. Now, why do I say research? Participating in a study, as this question mentions, is incredibly important for documenting the efficacy of an environmental unit and for getting insurance companies or government studies to fund research using a unit. You say, well, you know, right now we should have availability of this, and I could not agree more. I don't think it takes a lot more research. I think it takes people using it and having it paid for by some source, because, you know, a couple weeks, let's say, in a hospital is not inexpensive for families that are facing many financial challenges. But what I'm pointing out here is this is what we need, and there are things we can do on our personal level, in our homes, with our diet, foods, and so on, but to really get to all of the specific contributors and unmask a patient, determine if their illness is related to the myriad exposures that they have, one needs an environmental medical unit. I think this is a high priority in medicine, but it's not something people can do on their own right now. You can approximate, you can try to, you know, avoid toxic chemicals in your house, go through diet evaluations. The problem with diet is that you really almost have to eliminate everything or do one food at a time, and they have to be organic, and what family can do this on their own? This is really something that needs outside support, and I think the government has heard about this, they know about it, and as you know, there are a lot of other funding priorities, but frankly I can't think of anything more important than understanding the relationship between autism and our environmental exposures. So that's, you know, that's what I have to say about that. Can we get the slides? Thank you. Yes, it is. They are available. They will be available shortly after this presentation on YouTube, and the most of this information is in the ebook that you should have access to now. And it actually is a little more comprehensive because it's hard to say all the things I said in this presentation briefly and put all the information in there, but almost everything I've said is in the ebook, and it's probably explained a lot better because we have to carefully put that together, but everything about environmental units, about exposures that might lead to autism, ADHD, the 7 A's, those are all in the ebook. So I highly recommend you access that, and please feel free to distribute it to your friends and others you think might need to, your doctors, others who need to know about it. It's just a short ebook. It's about 32 pages total, small pages. It will help others understand this, even if they haven't had access to this information. Next question. So I mentioned about the EMUs. Currently, there are none available in the United States. Overseas, there was one in Japan, which with their change in administration does not currently have funding in not taking patients from the United States. In terms of preventable prenatal care, do you think a mother can take steps to make a big difference? With what would be steps you would recommend to a woman considering pregnancy with a family history of autism? I'd recommend reading all of this very carefully, avoiding things that have been implicated, and those are listed in the ebook, and that their doctors and friends and parents, you know, the mother's parents, should be talking to them about this concern before they even get pregnant if they're thinking about pregnancy. So this is not prenatal care, this is kind of pre-prenatal care. And families are most willing to adopt practices like those we've talked about, using no pesticides, avoiding chemicals, fragrances, chemicals that get in the air. They're most willing to do that when they are planning a pregnancy because they do care about their children. At least that's certainly been my experience. How did the early parents I met recognize food intolerances? And what about their symptoms? Did they figure it out through trial and error, wondering what they saw that tipped them off that their kids were tilted? What parents observe are often these Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kinds of responses. They notice that when their kids, for example, are take them out to eat, and they have something with a lot of caffeine, that the children just, get wild, or they'll have depressive episodes. They notice there's something going on related to their exposures. And this doesn't have to necessarily be toxic foods. These are food intolerances. We're losing our ability to tolerate our normal diet. But if there are pesticides in the foods or coloring agents or things of that sort, that makes matters even worse. Next question. What do you suggest to help clean our air at home and at work? At home we use air conditioning. That's good. You probably want to get a HEPA filter if you have asthma or autism or something in the family. HEPA filtration is a big help, and also filters that remove volatile organic chemicals, so-called charcoal filters, which are available from people who make air conditioning units. And if you're in a place, as mentioned here, with lots of cars, that is a concern. Increased rates of autism have been linked to living around freeways and in areas where there are emissions from coal-fired power plants. So cities have their own set of challenges, and it can be difficult, but not impossible to work up a child in a unit in the city. The unit that I mentioned in Japan, which I could show you pictures of, but in the interest of time, just say that it's like the pictures I showed you. But the unit in Japan is actually located in downtown Tokyo, but they have appropriate air filtration. They have an organic diet. They test foods one at a time. All these principles that I mentioned. Can you recover from tilt? Next question. Patients, in my experience, who have tilt recover gradually as they learn to avoid things that trigger their symptoms, and that's the key. And it can take not a matter of days and weeks, but could be months and years to get over the intolerances. They can feel better by just avoiding exposures and foods that trigger their symptoms, but recovering from these intolerances completely, so they can go back and live in the city again that was a problem before, or eat other things in their diet. Many of them are unable to do that, and I think that's a sad thing. We're dealing with an entire generation of people that are losing tolerance because of our chemical exposures. So recovery in terms of functioning normally, I know many people who are able to function normally, but not without very careful use of whatever choices of foods and where they live. It's a real challenge for people to exist like this, and that's why I put my emphasis on avoiding exposures that seem to initiate it, and especially in people who are more susceptible. Next question, I mentioned using organic food. What about genetically modified food as well? I think as an allergist, I'm not in favor of genetically modified foods because when we see a patient who's developed true food allergy, I mean IgE-mediated food allergy, and if that food contains bits of other foods in it that we don't know what they are, so many of these are genes that have been inserted from other foods, then we're never sure exactly what is in the foods that this patient may be reacting to. So I'm very concerned about the widespread use of genetically modified foods. Let's see. A question about a long surgery under anesthesia, say 9 hours or so. Could that spark symptoms of fibromyalgia, gluten, and other food sensitivities? Fibromyalgia is one of those conditions that's listed under TILT as the result of exposures, and anesthetics are definitely linked to loss of this TILT phenomenon. So I'd say yes, and particularly in a susceptible individual, I'm trying to get anesthesiologists to use the Queasy questionnaire with the patients that they take to surgery, because that is a huge exposure, being exposed to anesthetic agents, and especially for such a long period of time. So you want to know if you're dealing with someone who's more sensitive, and choose anesthetic agents based on that knowledge, things that are less toxic, and reducing the amount of exposure where possible, monitoring the patient carefully. The dose of anesthetic required in one person may be much less, and particularly in chemically intolerant individuals. They may get the effect of the anesthetic, but they also may get all the side effects, adverse side effects. So you want to gear exposure to anesthetic agents to the person who's more, person's susceptibilities. And if someone is chemically intolerant with other symptoms I mentioned here, they definitely need to let their anesthesiologist or surgeon know that, and make them aware, give them a booklet on TILT, make them aware that they need to be cautious about monitoring the individual, and that these other intolerances result from a major chemical exposure in susceptible people. And so, food intolerances and chemical intolerances may be initiated as the TILT process by exposures to anesthetic agents. Okay, so we're kind of getting ready to wrap up here, but I can keep going. Is there a cost for the Queasy? No, there's no cost for it. It's available online. It will be in the ebook that you get, and if you want to use it for research purposes, my only concern is that you have a researcher who can help you with the statistics and interpreting. And I've seen people try to use it, but if they don't know how to handle the statistics, it can be a real challenge. But on an individual basis, it's available to every physician, every patient, free of charge, and it's sufficient to just give them the Queasy and let them see if they or their patient are more susceptible. If that's the case, then need to be very careful about drugs that they might give the patient. Be aware and understand that there are people who are much more susceptible to the things, whether they're wearing fragrances, whether they're cleaning agents in the office, or anesthetic agents. It's important for doctors to understand this. I really encourage you to give this printed out, or just send the link to your physicians and encourage them to read it. That's the purpose. It's not, there's no cost, there's no profit in this, but it's based on some very good research and validated in the medical literature, and all that validation is on the actually included in the ebook you'll get and on the questionnaire itself. Have any children that were born with autism benefited from removal of toxins from their living space? I'd say yes, there are. A good example is the individual I mentioned, that case history, but there are many cases where people are benefiting and have gone to great lengths to improve their own home environments so their children do better. This is an area where we need not just environmental medical units, but studies over time to see how children do when their parents do adopt these measures. And if children are susceptible to exposures, you can do so many things with them, really great things with them in terms of helping them with learning, helping them with a wide variety of treatments. But if they're chemically susceptible, it's very difficult to change things unless you take care of that problem at the same time or first. The chemical questionnaire, question about where they can get it, will be on the link to this webinar, and it's on this last slide that I have up right now. The website is mentioned there. That's my website. The TILT ebook, that's on that last slide, that's still up. We have a newsletter, which you're welcome to sign up for free. This is all free. I do not want to make any money doing this. It's too important a problem. Too many people need this information. My colleague says information just wants to be free. And I think that's true. There's some information that's so important that it needs to be available freely. So if you have any trouble getting it, write to me, but it should be available to you through this seminar. Let's see, next. Is recovery from tilt possible with intensive detoxing to remove accumulated cellular load? You know, the detox measures is not enough research in my mind on it, and what we're dealing with are exposures like to volatile organic chemicals, pesticides, things that people need to avoid in their lives. So I'd say you start with the things that you can address, and I'm concerned about potential toxic effects of some of the detoxification strategies, although some of them are less toxic or relatively non-toxic. So I think you have to evaluate that with your physician. And the next question is, autism in fact an extreme manifestation of tilt? That's questioned, and I'd say that's the way I'm seeing it now, yes. And the proof of it lies in testing patients and introducing these preventive measures during pregnancy. And yes, I do think it is. If you read the little ebook that you'll get, the same brain areas that are affected by chemical intolerance, including the limbic system, the hippocampus, which is vital for new memories, the amygdala, which controls our feeling states. It's called the motion central. All of those areas are clearly affected by these kinds of chemical exposures. They've been implicated with chemical intolerance and in autism. So I think what we're dealing with may well be the most extreme, as you put it, manifestation of tilt. Unfortunately, it's occurring in our children. Adults have such a hard time coping with it themselves, but they're able to take the steps to avoid things and to change their diet. Children obviously need their parents' support in order to be able to do this. So that's all the questions I have here right now. I'd be delighted if you all will take a look at the ebook. If there are questions that aren't answered there, or if you wish to contact us through our newsletter, that would be great. But I'm excited about this. I've been working in the field of environmental health and environmental exposures first as an industrial hygienist back 30, 40 years ago, and now as a physician. And this is something that doctors just don't learn in medical school because it's not part of the medical literature. It's part of what I know because of my background as an industrial hygienist, working with people who became ill working in steel mills, working on coke ovens, people who became sick at the EPA building, people who become ill after their homes were sprayed with pesticides, people who remodeled their homes and became ill. All of this I've learned over the last 25 years or so, and these are in my technical papers. And so I'm very pleased to be able to share this information with you. And I wish most of the medical profession could learn these things too. But trust me, it's not in our medical school curriculum. I teach doctors. I'm the assistant dean for the MD, dual degree program, MD, MPH program, and we teach all of our students about tilt. But it is not in most medical school curriculum or textbooks. Hopefully that will change. That was a reason for preparing the ebook, to get it out there to doctors in training and to doctors in practice and families. So thank you. I really appreciate your attending this seminar, and happy to help in the future.
Thanks, Dr. Miller. We really appreciate your time. As she said, we'll be posting this presentation on YouTube very soon. It should be in the next 24 hours. It should be out there. And we will send the link to everybody for our YouTube channel. We had it in our emails earlier, and we will send it again with the survey that we sent, so you can subscribe for free and watch the presentation again. We'll also have the link to the ebook on the YouTube page, so if people want to keep downloading that, that's great. And this slide that we're looking at now will be in the presentation, so if people need to grab those links, they'll be out there. I want to remind everybody who's still on the call, we have many more presentations coming up, so be sure to check our website at autism.com and sign up for future free webinars. We also have continuing education webinars available. They do typically have a fee just for processing the continuing ed credits, but if you're looking for continuing ed, be sure and check back at autism.com and see what we have coming up. Dr. Miller, thank you, and I wish everybody a great day.
Thank you.